Hey guys, I've been having trouble with my sound, so I really hope this works. Okay, my name is Nicole Rice, and for my topic this week, I chose correctional institutions, which is like the specific topic, but I kind of just talked about criminal justice system in general. So I guess I'll start with why I chose this topic. Um, Actually, one thing that I'm very passionate about is kind of mass incarceration and the criminal justice system within the United States. And so when I was going through the topics, I was very excited that this was something that I could make a presentation about. And also, my mom, when she was a BYU college student, she used to teach classes to the inmates at Utah State Prison. So I thought that was super interesting, and I was like, oh my gosh, that would be so cool to do something within social work related to the criminal justice system. So I wanted to learn more about the topic. So starting off, the first article that I found is called "A Fight to Expose the Hidden Human Costs of Incarceration." So this article is from, oh my gosh, sorry, skipped ahead. This article is from a woman from Louisiana, and she wrote this article for the New Yorker. And she talks about how Louisiana has the highest per capita incarceration rate in the country, and how it also has the highest in custody mortality rate, which was actually very shocking to me because I don't know very much about Louisiana, but I feel like not much happens there. And so this was just very surprising to me that of all the states in the United States, that Louisiana was the one with the highest in custody mortality rate. So this article talked about how most in custody deaths occur in institutions that are inaccessible to the public, and just how if the public eye is not really paying attention, or they just turn their backs on the institutions, that things like this are more likely to happen. And this article kind of talks about how we should maybe be shifting our focus from the amount of people behind bars and like incarceration rates and everything like that, and turning to the more dangerous and sometimes unconstitutional conditions that are inside the nation's penal institutions. She kind of questioned, the legality and constitutionality of some of the things that are done within these prisons, and how obviously something is not right if the mortality rate is so high within these correctional institutions. And so because of this, we have a legal and moral obligation to make sure that the conditions within these places become less inhumane, and that they're just better circumstances and locations in general. She also talked about how COVID was an indicator of the reality of the situation, and how the COVID cases and the COVID deaths were not taken seriously at all. One of the things said that like people would have symptoms and try to get tested, but the institutions wouldn't let them get tested, and how people were dying and it was not being taken seriously, and how it was kind of one of the most lethal locations of COVID was in these institutions. And one thing that was very important to this article was that the voices of people behind bars are typically overlooked and discounted. When asked like what changed the writer's perception of the criminal justice system within the United States, she said that it was the voices of the people behind bars, and how hearing their stories and their situations really opened her eyes and made her realize the reality and the gravity of the situation. And so also because of this, we have an obligation to ensure that every person in the process, the criminal justice system in the justice process, that they're treated fairly and humanely, especially subordinated groups, because the law historically has subordinated certain groups, especially African Americans, and we need to recognize this as social workers and people who are striving for social justice, that the system is not always fair and it's not always humane, but that is something that we should strive for everyone to have in the process, because that's something that they deserve. So my next article is called "Effective Responses to Offenders with Intellectual Disabilities, Generalist and Specialist Services Working Together." So obviously from the title, you guys can tell that this is more of a social work perspective on the criminal justice system, and it talks about people with intellectual disabilities and how for them life in prison can be especially traumatizing, as well as victimizing and there is segregation and there's isolation there as well, which I think most people are aware is something that happens in the criminal justice system, but just how it can be especially difficult for people who also struggle with intellectual disabilities. And this article, it was very interesting because it focused on 10 different offenders and how they remained in the institutions. So like the next bullet point says, despite policies of de-institutionalization, many people with intellectual disabilities continue to live in mainstream institutional settings rather than in the community with support from disability services. So rather than like going back to a community and seeking help there, they will remain in the institution and in those mainstream settings in order to, get a better type of social work and just make sure that their needs are met, I guess. So the article also talks about how prison life often leads to heightened anxiety and insecurity for these people with intellectual disabilities, which is often linked to and caused by, forced association with other prisoners who would at times victimize the person, as well as frequent strip searching, access to illegal drugs, and enforced isolation, which kind of like the first bullet point are things that we kind of unfortunately typically think of within prisons and correctional institutions. But for people with intellectual disabilities, these things cause a higher like rates of anxiety and insecurity, and these can be particularly difficult and challenging for these individuals. So in talking about how we can help these offenders and how we can effectively respond to their struggles, it talked a lot about how the importance of relationships and how making sure that human relationships are central to their help and their treatment. And kind of like the last bullet point says that when interpersonal needs are met in a respectful way, this is likely to improve a person's psychological health, as well as act as a preventative to aggressive or other antisocial behavior. So it talked a lot about relationships and how these can both be helpful in terms of preventing crimes and preventing these offenses, but also after they have occurred and once these people are in the institutions, that they really need these beneficial and healthy relationships to help them keep going and to help them, have a better experience. Which kind of ties me into the code of ethics, even though I didn't specifically talk about the importance of human relationships. I think that is obviously very important, but I also thought that service and social justice were very important and tied to correctional institutions and the criminal justice system. Just for like the points that I put on the slide, helping people in need, addressing social problems, working on behalf of oppressed and vulnerable individuals, and then, teaching people about oppression and cultural and ethnic diversity, especially within the criminal justice system, the marginalization and oppression of minorities, especially African Americans. I think that social justice is very important in terms of that. So to compare and contrast the two articles, the first article talks about mainly one state in particular, which was Louisiana. And like I said, it also focused on the mortality rate within prisons. But it also focused on, the legality and the constitutionality of prison systems and how there might be something off that we should, aim to be better about. The second article mostly talked about social work within prisons, and it talked about 10 offenders, sorry, I couldn't think of the word, 10 offenders in particular who struggled with intellectual disabilities and how this affected their experience. And then also talked about treatment in and out of prisons and correctional institutions. So the 2 points that I brought together to compare the two articles, first was the importance of individuals within the correctional institutions, which also could be related to the code of ethics, the dignity and worth of a person. Because I think mostly the first article clearly talked about this, but also the second article focused on this as well. But realizing that the lives of these people within these institutions do matter, and that we should be trying to give them the best opportunities and the best help that they can get, and just understanding that they are people as well. And then the other point is that we should ensure that people are treated fairly and humanely within the criminal justice system, and to ensure that they receive the help that they really need. Which I think are both just very good points that both articles brought up, even though they weren't directly speaking about social work per se. So now my question, which is, how can social workers help individuals with their circumstances within the criminal justice system and in correctional facilities? Which I think is just something important that we can think about as, future social workers or future whatever, because this is something that a lot of people struggle with, and it's a large issue within our nation, and I just want to hear your thoughts on that. So that is the end of my presentation. I guess here are my sources, but I look forward to hearing what you guys have to say, and thank you so much for listening.